dissent that we had in the 70s, or are we going to right the ship?
But it sounds like you're saying that the comments in and of themselves that he's making aren't turning you off. In other words, you could get over it. If he seems to be evolving, if he can deliver more nuanced opinions in coming weeks and months,
well, he has a way, Donald Trump has a way of putting something out there that has you, your head pops up, your eyes pop out,
do you think he does it on purpose?
Seat. But then that's not enough. That gets your attention. Okay, take it from there. It's like saying, I want to build a big new building. Well, that's very nice, but what do you have in mind? He's moved into a vacuum, and the other candidates have let him pretty much occupy that ground. And that's why Cruz and Kasich, if he stays in, has to start putting real meat on the table, especially on the economy.
You say that Donald Trump has locked himself away in a vacuum. So what would you tell him? Is he not getting the kind of advice he needs to be getting?
Well, he's this is where you have to make some real hard decisions. He's gone very far, very fast, in a way that no one would have predicted. And so the tendency is, I've gotten this far against all expectations, why should I change? But sometimes when you get, it's like business, you reach a certain level of success, you say, I know what I'm doing. But as my father liked to say, if you think you've arrived, you're ready to be shown the door.
What about the tenor of the campaign? Last week we saw the two leading Republican candidates, Trump and Cruz, spending a lot of time debating whose wife is prettier.
Well, if they're there again, that would have been almost a weird side issue if they'd been debating, what do we do about trade? What do we do about the tax code? What do we do about the unraveling we see in Europe? What do we do about the increasingly dangerous situation in Asia? Then people would say, sideshow. Let's get back to the real issues. Instead, it became the headlines, because what else was there? Nothing.
Steve Forbes is the editor of Forbes magazine. His most recent book is titled Reviving America, How Repealing Obamacare, Replacing the Tax Code, and Reforming the Fed Will Restore Hope and Prosperity. He joined us from our studios in New York. Mr. Forbes, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The investigation into last week's Brussels attacks has revealed a disturbing development. Authorities say the two brothers at the center of the attacks had been watching a key Belgian nuclear researcher. There's speculation that might have been part of an effort to get material for a dirty bomb. NPR's counterterrorism correspondent Dina Temple-Raston reports from Brussels.
The story begins with a small camera hidden in the bushes of a home in Belgium belonging to a prominent nuclear researcher. NPR has withheld his name to protect his safety. Belgian and U.S. officials say that last summer, two men were seen outside the researcher's home. A passenger got out of the car and retrieved something from under a hedge, and then they disappeared. Who the two men were and what they were doing was a mystery. Until
two brothers who carried out the deadly suicide bombings of the airport and metro station in Brussels.
Identified Khalid El Bakraoui as the suicide bomber at Malbec metro station. They say his brother Brahim blew himself up at the airport.
The Belgian attacks helped authorities figure out what they'd seen last summer. Investigators are now certain the two men they saw that night were the El Bakraoui brothers. And what they retrieved from under the bushes was a video camera trained on the researcher and his family. 12 hours of this video was discovered last fall in an ISIS safe house after the attacks in Paris. Belgian authorities believe the brothers may have been plotting a kidnapping. Matthew Bunn is a specialist in nuclear security at Harvard's Kennedy School.
This is a pretty common terrorist or criminal tactic, to kidnap a family member, to coerce someone to help the terrorists.
And what the terrorists may have wanted was radiological material.
If what they wanted was to get radiological material for a dirty bomb from the nuclear site, they were a little befuddled, because it's much easier to get that from a hospital or an industrial site.
They aren't the only ones who are confused. Dirty bombs are often mistaken for suitcase nukes. Remember season 2 of the television show 24?
There's a nuclear device under terrorist control.
A dirty bomb is a regular bomb in most every way, except explosives are typically wrapped around radioactive material. Steve Sin focuses on illicit trafficking of those kinds of materials at the Terrorism Center at the University of Maryland. He says the effects of a dirty bomb really depend on how it's made. If you have a powdery radioactive substance, like cesium, and you wrap that in an explosive, it does more damage because it disperses more widely.
So imagine if you have baby powder on your counter, and you blow on it, and it goes everywhere.
But if you have something like cobalt-60, which is easier to obtain, it's usually in solid form and is less effective.
So if you have cobalt-60 as your material and you blow it up, what you end up with is smaller chunks within a certain radius, and it contaminates that particular area, and it doesn't have fallout or anything like that because it's not in the air.
It doesn't have fallout, he says, because it isn't in the air. If last week's explosions had been dirty bombs, the casualty numbers probably would have been about the same, but the cleanup, much worse. Brecht Volders is a PhD candidate at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Volders says if ISIS had detonated dirty bombs last week, that would have been a turning point for terrorism.
The psychological impact can be very strong, as they would be the first group to use it. Terrorism is always about creating a sense of fear.
Even though nothing came out of the surveillance video, Belgian and American officials say the landscape has changed. The idea of a terrorist group trying to secure materials for a dirty bomb used to be theoretical. Now it's specific. Dina Temple-Raston, NPR News, Brussels.
Later today on All Things Considered, we hear why the cell phones are blacked out in the capital city of Pakistan. And this is NPR News.
This is WNYC, and you can hear All Things Considered at 4 o'clock here on WNYC later on this afternoon. Coming up in just a few minutes, we will look at Donald Trump's business dealings in Atlantic City. That story coming up. And then a little bit later on the Brian Lehrer Show, a conversation with Jane Sanders, Bernie Sanders' wife. Plus, hear why and when corporations care about gay rights. That's coming up this morning at 10 o'clock on the Brian Lehrer Show. Sunny skies today. Highs will be in the mid-50s. Partly cloudy tonight. Lows in the upper 40s. A little bit warmer tomorrow, with highs in the upper 60s with mostly sunny skies. And then Thursday night, rain is likely with a chance of thunderstorms and rain on Friday. Highs in the upper 60s. Right now, 37 degrees.
WNYC is supported by Shepherd Mullen, a global law firm with more than 750 lawyers handling corporate and employment matters, key litigation, IP, and complex financial transactions for companies in New York and beyond. More at shepherdmullen.com.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. A court in Cyprus is ordering an Egyptian man to be held after authorities say he admitted to hijacking an Egypt Airjet and diverting it to the airport in Larnaca. The BBC's Yolanda Nell reports.
This was a brief court hearing in which local police were granted more time to hold Saifuddin Mustafa in custody as they investigate the hijacking of an Egypt Air domestic flight. In Cairo, relatives of Mr. Mustafa have been questioned. His motivations for forcing Flight 181 to divert to Larnaca are said to be personal, involving his Cypriot ex-wife.
Police say he was wearing a fake explosives belt when he hijacked the Airbus with more than 70 people aboard during a flight from Alexandria to Cairo. 2 Mormon missionaries wounded in last week's terrorist bombings in Belgium are back in the U.S. Mason Wells and Joseph Emery are being treated for their injuries at a hospital in Utah. There's a new government in Myanmar. NPR's Anthony Kuhn says it was sworn in today, led by pro-democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi.
It won't be easy for the new government to meet expectations for change, especially with the country's military still so influential in politics. The country remains one of Asia's poorest. Large parts of it are controlled by armed ethnic insurgents, and the incoming ruling party, the National League for Democracy, has no experience in running a government.
I'm Dave Mattingly, NPR News in Washington.
I'm Richard Hake on WNYC in New York. A major economic development project in the Bronx has hit a snag. WNYC's Ilya Maritz reports that work on a proposed world-class ice rink is on hold until the developers can show that they've raised all the funds the city expects.
The Kingsbridge National Ice Center, or NIC, is supposed to be the leading center for ice sports for miles around. It's backed by former New York Ranger Mark Messier. But work can't begin until NIC's investors get the keys to the old Kingsbridge Armory building, a red brick castle that's been vacant for years. And New York City's Economic Development Corporation won't hand the keys over until it's convinced that NIC's investors have raised $158 million for Phase 1 of construction. The people behind NIC say the money is pledged. The EDC says all the money needs to be on hand. Bronxborough President Ruben Diaz Jr. says it's time to cut the developers some slack.
It's something that the city wants, it's something that people in the Bronx want, and, there's been enough delay.
One strange wrinkle to all this, Nick's biggest source of funds is Empire State Development, which is providing loans that could be worth over $100 million. That would mean, in effect, that the state's Economic Development Agency is putting up the dollars so that the city's Economic Development Agency will allow this private development to go ahead. And private investors, so far they have not rushed in to fund this project. Nick's investors now face an April 25th deadline to show they've raised the cash they need to take control of the armory. For WNYC, I'm Ilya Meritz.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Home Instead Senior Care, offering individualized in-home care and resources for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, including hands-on training for family caregivers. More at homeinstead.com/NPR. Citrix, creator of GoToMeeting, an online meeting solution designed to allow users to collaborate and present from anywhere. Information about being a meeting MVP is at gotomeeting.com. And the National Geographic Channel, presenting the story of God with Morgan Freeman, who travels the world exploring questions like what happens when we die, why does evil exist, and who is God? New series premieres Sunday at 9 on the National Geographic Channel.
It's Morning Edition on WNYC. I'm Richard Hake. With the presidential primary fight now moving to New York, Republican voters who know Donald Trump best will be making their choice, but his long history of business deals could cause a problem for him. WNYC's Janet Babin reports that history includes 4 bankruptcies that lost billions of dollars for banks, bondholders, and small business people.
One of Donald Trump's marquee selling points to the American people is his deal-making genius.
That's what I could do for the country. We owe $19 trillion. Boy, am I good at solving debt problems. Nobody can solve it like me.
Decades ago, Trump co-authored a book about his business prowess called The Art of the Deal. But soon after the ink was dry on the book, Trump's 3 hotel casinos in Atlantic City started to go bankrupt.
Hundreds of companies I've opened. I've used it 3 times, maybe 4 times. Came out great, but I guess I'm supposed to come out great.
But these casino projects were some of the priciest, high-profile deals of Trump's career, involving billions. And the people who lent him money or provided goods and services for the casinos lost big. And the chief architect, the decider of these soured projects, was Donald Trump himself.
This guy shot a hole in his own boat in a big way.
That's Pat Sullivan. In the late 1980s, he was a young attorney at Jones Day. The law firm successfully sued Donald Trump in a complicated bankruptcy case. The point of the case was to get Trump to settle, in other words, to pay some of the money that he owed to these bondholders. Sullivan says the team did this by threatening to float bonds that they named Trump Futures. Now, these bonds were to be sold on the open market, and they would represent a piece of their bankruptcy lawsuit against Donald Trump.
So it's the device that, along with the bankruptcy code, which was relatively new at that point.
The bond values would then go up or down based on whether Trump had any money to settle these claims.
What we thought was it would create leverage in the negotiations with Trump. We would use the Trump brand against him, and we thought once the shares were public and widely dispersed, it'd be harder for him to settle, that he would want to sell before they were issued.
Sullivan and his colleagues were right. Trump settled, though the creditors didn't get much because Sullivan says Trump didn't have much money by then. Still, this settlement was part of a chain of failed Trump deals that eventually brought him to his financial knees. The most egregious of Trump's bankruptcies involved the Taj Mahal.
Donald Trump gave Michael Jackson a personal tour of his $1.2 billion extravaganza. And we were there every step of the way.
Trump took over construction of the hotel and casino in what appeared to be this sweetheart deal from actor Merv Griffin. But actually, Griffin, it turned out, owed a lot of debt on the casino himself. Trump spent $1 billion to open the Taj and financed it with huge loans at high interest rates. Plus, when it did open, it then had to compete with Trump's 2 other hotels and casinos and a bunch of others on the boardwalk. About a year after opening, the Taj filed for bankruptcy, reportedly owing nearly $3 billion to creditors. And Sullivan says it's not like Trump learned from this mistake. It happened 3 times in Atlantic City and once at the Plaza Hotel in New York.
Basically, his playbook is the same. His drug of choice is leverage. He just piles debt on.
While Trump points out he never filed for personal bankruptcy, Sullivan says Trump did have to sell his yacht, his airline, and surrendered control of his checkbook to creditors. In 1989, investigative journalist Wayne Barrett had started writing a book called Trump, The Deals and the Downfall.
I signed the book in 89, and it comes out at the end of 91. When I signed the book, he was the king of the hill. I mean, he was one of the most prominent businessmen in America. He collapsed during the period of time that I was writing and reporting the book.
Barrett says Trump's drastically fast descent was marked by a profound recklessness. He remembers Trump testifying in front of a New Jersey regulatory body called the Casino Control Commission, saying he wouldn't need high-risk so-called junk bonds to finance his new casino.
He completely misrepresented under oath that he could get traditional bank financing for the Taj in order to get them to approve the deal. And then he went out and bought junk bonds. At that hearing, he said, you know what junk bonds are? They're junk. I'm the guy who doesn't have to do junk bonds. And then he did junk bonds.
Trump has his own version of events. In a debate broadcast by Fox News, Trump insisted that he got out of Atlantic City before it cratered, and that his bankruptcies didn't cause any harm.
First of all, these lenders aren't babies. These are total killers. These are not the nice, sweet little people that you think, okay?
That's a guinea hen you see fly up on the roof. We got blueberries, just all kinds of stuff. It's awesome. Yeah.
Mike Deal is showing my colleague Matt Katz around his New Jersey farm. Deal ran freehold pianos for decades before turning it over to his son and grandkids. He provided Trump's casino at the time with $100,000 worth of pianos.
Most of the conference room would have a piano. When you walked into Taj Mahal, you saw a nice big player grand piano.
Deal got a letter from the Taj saying he'd have to accept less money for his pianos or possibly get nothing in a lengthy bankruptcy case. In 50 years in the musical instrument business, Deal says this had never happened to him before.
Usually in the piano business, the people you're doing business with have money, and it's the type of item that you don't expect to get stuck on.
This time, though, Deal did get stuck. He had to settle with Trump's casino so bad at night, she sleeps at an angle in her first-floor bedroom to stay out of the line of fire. The company that runs her apartment, Oakmont Management, wouldn't comment. It's being sued by the city for unlivable conditions at another apartment. Glover says her place has been allowed to go downhill, too. She grew up nearby and recalls looking at these apartments and thinking they were so nice. If she lived here, she'd be rich. Now she doesn't know where else to go. Neither does Terrell Walker, who doesn't make much more than minimum wage.
I honestly think for me to get into a decent home with my income, it would be very hard. It would be very hard because I wouldn't be able to afford it. Not with the prices that they have these days, I wouldn't be able to afford that. I wouldn't.
Walker says anything over $800 a month is out of her league. Anything under $800 is pretty much what she already has. Pam Fessler, NPR News.
We have another housing story coming up in just a little bit. Erin Moselle going to report on who's moving into new public housing in the Sharswood section of North Philadelphia. That's coming up this morning at 8:45. It's 8:30. This is WHYY's Morning Edition.
WHYY is supported by Glen Mead, an independent trust company providing investment and wealth management services to families, endowments, and institutions. More from Laura LaRosa at 215-419-6027.
I'm Jennifer Lynn. Good morning. In the news, in Pennsylvania, 2 white Democrats running for state attorney general are battling over criminal justice issues affecting the African-American community. WHYY's Katie Culinary reports.
It all started when Allegheny County District Attorney Stephen Zappala's campaign ran this ad.
He didn't need a traffic stop in Texas, a shooting in South Carolina.
It features video of the state trooper pulling over Sandra Bland, a black woman who died later in police custody, and a clip of Walter Scott, an unarmed black man running away from the white officer who shot him in the back. The ad goes on to tout Zappala's conviction of a white officer in Pittsburgh who shot an unarmed black man in the 1990s. Last week, black clergy supporting Montgomery County Commissioner Josh Shapiro, the Democratic frontrunner in the Attorney General's race, slammed Zappala for pandering to black voters and questioned his record on police-involved shootings. Marshall Mitchell is pastor of Salem Baptist Church in Jenkintown.
We are very sensitive about the images of black suffering. We're also very, very concerned about the cheapening of life in the African American community.
At a press conference in Philadelphia, Zappala marshaled his supporters, including black religious leaders and State Senator Anthony Williams, to defend the ad and his record.
I don't want to see this campaign divided based on race, nor was it intended to create issues strictly along those lines.
Meanwhile, Zappala's campaign released a second ad, very similar to the first, eliminating images and references to the deaths of Bland and Scott. Shapiro is also hitting the airwaves with an ad featuring Philadelphia City Council President Darrell Clarke, who says Shapiro will make reforms to deal with the state's overcrowded prisons, issues important to black voters. Katie Culinary, WHYY News.
8:32, we check on issues important to commuters with Eric Kerr.
And we've got plenty of those for sure. First of all, in Upper Moreland Township, this closure is continuing in the general vicinity of Horsham Road and Easton Road. Transformer fire, the reason there. And adding insult to injury is an accident on Woodhaven Road, westbound side between Route 13 and Millbrook, so definitely watch for an extra slowdown there. And we have an extra jam up on the 30 bypass eastbound between Fisherville Road and Euclid Avenue. Going the other way, we have a ramp restriction here because of the disabled tractor trailer. Update made possible by Unbound.org. I'm Eric Kerr for WHYY.
This morning on Radio Times, after the BBC at 9, Peggy Orenstein on her new book on girls and sex. Radio Times this morning at 10 on WHYY. It's 8:33, 40 degrees right now in Philly, 37 in Malvern, 38 in Hockessin.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Squarespace, providing tools to help people showcase their passions with a customizable landing page, website, or online store. Learn more at squarespace.com/NPR. From the Cy Sims Foundation. Since 1985, supporting advances in science, education, and the arts towards a better life. More information is available at cysimsfoundation.org. And from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation at rwjf.org.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Renee Montaigne.
And I'm Rachel Martin. The Arab Spring started in Tunisia in 2011, and that country remains one bright spot in the fitful march to reform. It has a functioning democracy, but it also has a militant problem which threatens that democracy. Estimates show more Tunisians than any other nationality have joined extremist groups like the Islamic State. One reason they're able to do it is the largely open border between Tunisia and neighboring Libya. NPR's Leila Fadel was just on that border, and she joins us now from Casablanca, Morocco. Good morning, Leila.
Good morning.
What has it meant for Tunisia to share a border with such an unstable place like Libya?
Right, it has a border of almost 300 miles between Tunisia and Libya, and what that has meant for Tunisia is that there's a bunch of weapon smuggling and people smuggling going on, and so people are able to go back and forth across this border where there's a security vacuum, plan attacks, and come back into Tunisia and carry those out. So last year we saw an attack at the Bardo Museum, an attack on tourists at the beach, an attack on security forces on a bus, and then most recently this border town that the extremist group, the Islamic State, tried to take over, which is the town that I visited.
So we said in the intro that more Tunisians than any other nationality are joining the ranks of ISIS. Why? What's motivating them?
This is a place, like many in the region, where people came out of this revolt in 2011 and they really had a sense of hope that now things would get better. And in some cases, they have. But for the average person, a lot of young Tunisians who thought they could have a better life in the sense of job security and economic prosperity haven't really seen that. And so this is how one Tunisian analyst, Youssef Sharif, described it to me.
There is the relative deprivation where people are not very poor, not dying of hunger, but they are not very rich. When they go to school, they get education, they have high expectations, but they don't find the job they want. And that creates a lot of anger in them.
He says that anger, that frustration, is something that groups like ISIS are exploiting. They're saying, listen, we can give you all the stuff that these corrupt dictatorial regimes can't give you.
All right, so how is the Tunisian government reacting to the fact that so many of their citizens are leaving to join ISIS?
Well, they're rolling out a major propaganda campaign to try to tell people why they shouldn't go join ISIS. But there's a lot of people that are worried that the government is and will continue to overreact, to treat people badly, to conduct torture in prisons as a way to stop terrorism. And that's something that human rights defenders and analysts say is an even bigger threat to Tunisia's democracy if this police state is reconfigured and all of the things that people fought for in 2011 go to the wayside.
How has the U.S. reacted? I mean, I imagine that they've been tracking what's been happening in terms of the radicalization in Tunisia.
Right, the U.S. is concerned. Right now, Tunisia is building a wall on the Libyan border. It's a little over 100 miles, and that's something that both Germany and the U.S. are helping with when it comes to electronic equipment. And also, if you remember, there was an airstrike recently in Libya that targeted ISIS fighters, and the targets were actually mostly Tunisian, especially that main target of the U.S. airstrike was a Tunisian ISIS fighter. So there definitely is concern.
NPR's Leila Fadel speaking to us from Casablanca, Morocco. Thanks so much, Leila.
Thank you.
We've heard a lot about the emotional and physical challenges of caring for someone with Alzheimer's. A new report finds that for friends and family members, it can also be costly. NPR's John Hamilton has the story.
6 years ago, Paul Hornback was a senior engineer and analyst for the Army when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He was just 55.
I was kind of at the height of my career, and then this dreadful diagnosis came, and it just wiped out every plan I had for my career.
Hornback and his wife Sarah had to reimagine their future. Then they began to consider the financial implications. The Hornbacks, who live in Kentucky, had borrowed a lot of money to put 3 children through college. Now Paul was being forced to retire early, and they wouldn't have his salary to pay off the debt.
I mean, we had to sell basically everything but my wife's car and an old truck that I kept to drive around here on the farm.
At first, Sarah Hornback kept working as a school administrator. Then, about 18 months ago, she also had to retire early to care for her husband.
Got to the point where it just wasn't safe for him to stay alone just because of memory and decision making. You know, he might leave the stove on. He might decide that there was a tree branch bothering him and he should get out the chainsaw.
The Hornbacks are getting by on their early retirement income. But Sarah Hornback says the real financial problems will start when she can no longer care for her husband on her own.
When he has to go into full-time care, it will require us to pay all of our savings, which will leave me at the poverty level, basically.
There are lots of stories like that among people who help care for the 5.4 million Americans with Alzheimer's. Beth Kallmeyer of the Alzheimer's Association says hearing those stories prompted the group to do a national survey of more than 3,500 people.
And what we found was really startling. The cost of paying for care was putting people in a situation where they had to make really difficult choices around basic necessities. Things like food, medical care, transportation.
The survey found that people who help care for someone with Alzheimer's spent more than $5,000 a year of their own money on average. Half of them used savings or retirement funds to cover the costs, and 13% sold personal items, such as a car. Kallmeyer says the burden is greatest for people like the Hornbacks, who have to pay more while working less.
It's really a double whammy. People are sometimes not able to work as much or not able to work at all in order to provide care, and then they're paying money out of pocket on top of that.
Kallmeyer says the survey also found that many Americans believe Medicare will help cover the costs of a nursing home. It won't.
So what that tells us is that families are ultimately unprepared for that really, really significant cost of long-term care.
Clinics that specialize in Alzheimer's have begun trying to help family members navigate the financial aspects of care. Pierre Theriault is a geriatric psychiatrist and director of the Banner Alzheimer's Institute in Phoenix.
It's a challenge for almost every family that we see. I mean, we do see folks who are lucky and have considerable resources, but even for those families, it's a major financial obligation.
And Theriault says it's not realistic to expect every family to absorb the cost.
Ultimately, society will need to think of other ways of funding care for our elders as they become vulnerable.
So far, though, efforts to help families pay for long-term care haven't provided much relief. John Hamilton, NPR News.
And this is NPR News.
pitchers may provide the most drama this baseball season. Rachel Martin talks to Jessica Mendoza about the season ahead at 8:51 coming up on Morning Edition on WHYY.
Penn Medicine's Living Donor Liver Transplant Program supports WHYY. When it comes to a liver transplant, time is of the essence. The Penn Transplant Institute is committed to reducing wait times and to saving lives. With a team of specialists guiding patients through every step of the transplant process, Penn offers those suffering from end-stage liver disease and liver failure a chance of long-term survival. Learn more at pennmedicine.org/liver transplant.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC NewsHour. On today's programme, thousands of jobs at stake in Britain as the Indian conglomerate Tata decides to sell off its UK steel business. And Burma swears in its first civilian president in more than 50 years.
BBC comes up at 9.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. A man detained in Belgium as a possible suspect in last week's terrorist bombings in Brussels has been let go by authorities. Terry Schultz reports on the investigation.
Investigators have had to release a suspect they thought was the third man seen in airport surveillance video. After charging him with terrorist murder, he's been freed for lack of evidence. But the Belgian justice minister is asking people to focus less on alleged missteps like this and more on working together to find the suspects who remain on the run.
ISIS claims responsibility for the airport and train station bombing